So yes, we're on Lent 4. Our theme for this week is Sabbath. And I'm going to begin by reading to you the piece on Sabbath from the book that I've been looking at. How many light bulbs does it take to change a Christian? And this is what it says about Sabbath. In the Genesis account of creation, the crown of creation is not humanity created on the 6th day, but the Sabbath, which was instituted on the 7th day, when even God rested. And we don't imagine he did so because he was tired. Sabbath rest isn't meant to be what happens when our minds and bodies finally give out on us, and stressed and exhausted we drop by the wayside for a bit to draw breath before carrying on rushing around and consuming. Sabbath is the regular rest, deep spiritual rest, remembering God and putting all of life in perspective. So I've been thinking a little bit about this Sabbath thing, and I'm not going to talk for long because Neil is going to be coming and talking to us and showing us his slides. But in simple terms, the Sabbath is a day that we take to recenter ourselves amid the rush of the week, to mindfully change rhythm, to intentionally direct our thoughts towards God. God instituted this day of rest, taking one himself on the 7th day of creation, a day blessed and made holy by him. A day that Jesus tells us in Mark 2 is made for our benefit. In some points of history and in some denominations, we found ourselves serving the Sabbath rather than vice versa. When I was doing my prayer before the 8:30 service, I was in the vestry and something suddenly struck me, which I should have thought of before. So let's take this as inspiration. But I was reflecting on COVID. And before COVID came along, I think we would have been surprised that we could take a rest from things like work, business, church, and that everything would be okay. We weren't able to gather in church during COVID, and at the beginning of that we thought, is this the end of the church as we know it? And people who are running businesses, are we going to survive because we're not open 6 or 7 days a week, long hours anymore? Will we survive this? But we discovered during COVID that we could. We had to change our rhythm. We had to do things differently. But we survived. And in fact, in many ways, nature thrived. Do you remember, because we weren't flying around in aeroplanes willy-nilly and driving our cars willy-nilly everywhere, and factories had often closed down, that the skies across the world became clear. Places where there'd been fog and smog and haze for decades were now beautiful and blue again. And reports all over the world of animals, creatures, and plants beginning to flourish in places that they hadn't been seen for a long time, just because we'd stopped running around and messing around and doing what we do to the world. Because Sabbath rest extends beyond humanity. It extends to creation, the land, and everything that God has made. It's not and never has been sustainable to overcultivate. Sabbatical years for the land, known as St.Peter, meaning release, where the land is to lie fallow with all agricultural activity forbidden, is prescribed in Exodus and Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Even before our intensive practices were established, rest for the land was essential. This is a matter of justice for the land and for people and for animals and for creation. And in those Old Testament words, God assured his people that they would not starve and the provision would not fail. It did not fail, and it saw them through the fallow years. Dare we, in today's manic culture, busy culture, dare to bless the land with a Sabbath rest? Then I invite Neil to come to share with us.
I really appreciate that introduction that Sulin has given. And the two readings today, the Ephesians one, all about light, and the John reading about giving light to blindness. Seems to be a bit of a human condition. Well, How many light bulbs does it take to light up a Christian? A bit of light shone on an issue can familiarize you with it. We've been going through that. But I can tell you, as somebody who spent 38 years in the high school classroom, that don't think the first time you go through it, they've got it. And I'm very much like that. It really does take, photographically, multiple exposures, sometimes with intense light, to really grasp the meaning behind situations and images. Well, this lovely little place, I took that photo when this church was reconsecrated in the summer of 2008. And this church has meant a lot to our family. I realized the other day that we walked in the door first time 42 years ago. This little guy is 47 now. I've been doing Earth Day posters with my classes almost since Earth Day was created back in the 70s. But that was a different way of looking at things. Looking at the Sabbath, which is familiar to every churchgoer, you might wonder, which Sulin pre-explained, why topics like water, waste, and transport would be mixed in. Well, it's deeply rooted in this whole business of lifestyle. Like it or not, members of all cultures learn to behave like each other. That's simply how we function. Probably the best example is how we speak. Where did she come from? We know where she comes from. She would know where we come from if we were in Britain, because we sound like each other. But voice and communication is only a part of it. That's the surface. How we worship, that's another example. How we shop, So Sabbath, it's just a number, Sabbath, 7, in Hebrew and Arabic. And so I tell you, last week, I just had a birthday, and I turned Saba wa Sabayin. How old am I? Well, its origin, we know, comes from Genesis and Leviticus, talking about Sabbath for the land. But there's an extension to the every 7 years, and that's the 7 times 7, in which there was to be a Jubilee year. And to quote the Bible, "So in the 50th year, on the Day of Atonement, you shall sound a ram's horn all through the land and proclaim a release to the land and all its inhabitants." It's really unclear if that actually ever happened. But here on the West Coast, interestingly enough, redistribution of wealth was very much a fact with the First Nations people. It's called potlatch. So we shut it down. Well, I'd like to have just a bit of a look at different cultures' responses to Sabbath. This is a Coptic Christian church. Now, Coptic, you see the PT in Coptic. Egypt has PT in it also. The Copts claim to be the original Egyptians, long before Islam came about. Some people take it very seriously. In fact, friends of ours, Copts, said that it was a real issue to be a faithful Copt because there were so many holy days, but you had to conform to it if you were part of the community. That's the Coptic cathedral in the southern city of Aswan. Now, this is back into Cairo, Egyptian Muslims during Ramadan. Well, Islam has a parallel to Lent, and it's called Ramadan. Faith and culture there really run very tightly together. It's much more of a public and community exercise. You know it's Ramadan. People are all reading the Quran, even on the subway, and so on and so forth. Quite unlike us. We happen to live between 2 mosques, so there was no doubt about the 5 prayer calls during each day. The Egyptians I worked with were really delightful people. They are fine, self-deprecating, funny people. But if I were there, and that's in the middle of the afternoon, and while we were conducting business, the prayer call came, "Excuse me, Mr. Neil, we must pray now." That's just what they did. Now this, bless us, we got to go to Ethiopia. This was an amazing event. It was their key commemoration day of the year, St. George's Day. People came from all around. We could hardly believe where all these people coming from as we were headed to the Church of Lalibela. There's a number of them that are dug down into the ground. And they were coming for their cleansing ceremony, which is the next slide. A fascinating thing to be part of with all the incense and the sound. It's like we were flies on the wall. They didn't even notice us. Well, humorously, one of the guys there said, the problem with the Orthodox people is they never get anything done. They're always celebrating some occasion. They claim possession of the Ark of the Covenant. The next photo is really the root of the three monotheistic faiths. And they're found, of course, in Jerusalem. This is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. It's on the site of Solomon's Temple, which was first destroyed by the Babylonians about 600 BC, built again and then destroyed by the Romans around 70 AD. Faith and history coexist at the Wailing Wall, and this is the remaining western foundation of Solomon's Second Temple. Tradition is indeed the foundation of Orthodox Judaism and probably most religions. Our son was working with the UN in Jerusalem at this time, and we were there on the eve of Yom Kippur. It's becoming sundown, and everybody has to get home in preparation for that very holy day. The day is the acknowledgement of personal and corporate sin. All traffic comes to a halt. The streets are silent, they flash orange, and this applies to you whether you're Jewish or not. The place is shut down. For the next day, when the Orthodox dress in white. Business carries on for some people, but you can identify an Orthodox. So I'm going to return to Solomon for just a moment. And this is a painting done by one of the best artists who ever lived, Rembrandt. This was how he envisioned Solomon. He's king of Israel at the height of its glory, roughly 1,000 years BC. His silver mines somewhere in Northeast Africa gave him both political and economic power over the then known world. I think Solomon's story is a very short lesson in the history of humanity. We have our ways, and we think they'll last forever. He was given the gift of wisdom, but he was so consumed by his commercial enterprises, he began to ignore some of the basics of his faith. He had marriage contracts with some 700 women to gain control over the land in which they lived. But he neglected his families. So his son Rehoboam ruled harshly, and just in that short 2 generations, the kingdom of Israel was split. I'm tempted to see our almost worship of billionaires as a reasonable parallel. Billionaires have incredible business savvy. You have to respect that. But one of the things that is of great concern to me and others is we're not too sure how much social savvy they have. And you can reflect on a few billionaires on the news. This is Sally McFaig. I recently encountered her writing. She's an American biblical scholar who taught at Yale Divinity School. She died recently in Vancouver. She deserves recognition as the wise woman archetype. The wisdom of Solomon is in her writing. Her book, Blessed Are the Consumers, in that she calls consumerism the most successful religion on the planet, with its catastrophic results for humanity and the planet. Our insatiable appetites are literally consuming the world as we live way beyond the Earth's global means. Well, is it possible that our lives are actually built as much on faith in financial stability as anything else? Consider for a moment, what's a dollar? Is it a fact or is it a belief? I've worked with all kinds of currencies, and there are some that's just a piece of paper. But if somebody believes in your piece of paper or your coin, then it has value, even though we might think of it as a fact. The recent collapse of the Silicon Valley Bank in the US probably is a pretty good demonstration of fragility in that belief. So, we who are baby boomers, that's me, first one, have lived very peaceful, stable lives, enjoying for decades the lifestyle that simply seemed to get better and better. Well, you know, is it possible to go shopping and resist the Costco type bulk buying or the out-of-season fruits or veggies packed in plastic? We didn't have those when we were kids. As with all good things, however, change is never far away. People feel discouraged by hearing about the climate crisis or worried about affording the future, and some with very good reason. In the US right now, there's a phrase for let's get back to the old days. It's MAGA, make it great again. You know, and when was that? Well, we're not sure, but it just had to be better than it is now. Isn't this lovely? It comes out of Egypt. It runs backwards. That's how you go back. You put it on your wall and you live. It's Groundhog Day. No, I will say, though, it's just a fun clock. They don't have backwards clocks. But down here, the thing that looks like 7 is actually 6, or Sita. And the V next to it is Saba. I wouldn't be giving this talk if I didn't think that we had the faith to bridge the gap between all that is seen here on earth and the great unseen. Our energy, effort, and faith will make a difference to the earth in a future that looks uncertain. That's Tagish Lake near Atlin. We have good old friends who have a really much simpler solution, and it's called end times theology. Years ago, they headed out to this place to avoid the coming tribulation. Last year, my friend said to me, you don't have to worry about the ocean rising up to your door. The Earth's not going to be here long enough for that to happen. To quote Brian McLaren, religion itself can become an evacuation plan for the next life because we don't see much of significance in the world around us. Our place, this is Victoria. And I discovered when I tried to help a homeless guy here that there's about half a dozen agencies in town and they're all plugged. But what I love that Sulin and others are really promoting is bridging the gap, trying to close what seems to be widening and widening. Sabbath, as she says, is not just about abstaining. It's about doing also. You don't have to be a person who works there, though we know somebody who did, and it's exhausting. But you can support those people in your own small way. We hope to see the restoration of the Valley of Dry Bones, just a bit at a time in our personal lives and contribution of Sabbath to the land. Today's scripture, John 9, Jesus got in trouble. He tried to go against the establishment. Protest is what we call it these days. And sometimes it's really risky to protest to try to change things. I'm not one of those persons. We have people in our communion here who are. Bless them. Well, quick review of our faith in action that we've been working on. We have abundance in nature, and we really hope to care for gardens and keep the bees going, and the butterflies, and the different varieties of food. But we have the tendency to commodify a resource. And as a result of that, when we commodify it, we seem to just overdo it. That's 2 years ago, right out in front of our house. 2 years later, there's almost nothing. It doesn't mean it's over, but it's a pretty dodgy business. Read labels. Learn about the people who produce your food. Between this cheap brand where the producers get very little and the next one, which is fair trade, This is a mall in Egypt. Globalism has brought it to all of us. I encourage you, we try to buy local. Try to find out the cost of importing food from far away that's not in season here. Our basic needs are so satisfied that our appetites become more sophisticated, and malls are great for that. We who can afford it are constantly being bombarded with enticement to upgrade or try this, it's all new. That's whether we're talking about food, electronics, appliances, travel. I'll give you 3 words and I'm done. Change, balance, and redemption.